Hello, Environmental Policy 1 students. We're back for week 12, Alternatives to Traditional Regulation. This week I'm going to provide a quick overview of these various policy instruments because there are many different subcategories of each of them, but I want you to get a good feel for what are some of the alternatives that you see in the press and you'll see in your readings on that are alternatives to traditional regulatory approaches. Market-based economic instruments is obviously one of the more prominent ones out there, and we're seeing that in the press a lot lately, right? When we talk about Ontario's new cap-and-trade system, we're talking about pricing carbon by the federal government and these kinds of things. Well, what is a cap-and-trade system? Well, remember I told you last week that performance standards set a certain level of performance that is expected under a regulation. Well, market-based instruments don't exactly do that. They all have components of that in them as well. For example, in a cap-and-trade system, industries would basically be given a certain amount of emissions based on the volume of production of that industry within a sector. So if they were allowed to emit certain number of megatons of greenhouse gases. Those would be apportioned or they would be auctioned off, whatever mechanism the government decides to use. And an industry would buy certain permits. Now, or they would be apportioned permits. It varies across the world in how it's done. But when it's done, that company would have a certain amount of emission that it would be allowed to do. If it did much better than that, because market-based instruments, again, don't stipulate how you do it, as long as you're not transgressing any other law or regulation. Some company might buy, say, 100 megatons of greenhouse gas emissions, but be able to get their production process clean enough that they're only emitting 75 megaton. So then they would have 25 megatons of greenhouse gas emissions to sell to those in the industry who were not able to achieve their greenhouse gas emission targets and maybe went over, and they would get a severe fine from the government or some other penalty if they didn't have the equivalent number of emission credits. So they would have to buy from the cleaner company to justify their level of emission. That's called so you can see how the pricing mechanism and the market is used to adjust a regulated community towards an environmental performance standard. But you know, that standard is not a hard cap. If you buy more emissions credits, you can get away with emitting more. And that's the difference between this approach to performance standards and a regulation that stipulates a performance standards, where if you go over, you're not in compliance. There's no option to buy credits or anything like that. And then there's other pricing mechanisms that are used in market-based instruments as well. Like the federal government may decide that the best way to proceed is actually a carbon tax, a price on carbon rather than a cap and trade. Then the price on carbon applies to everybody in the same way. Then it's up to the regulated communities to control their emissions in as effective and efficient a way as possible, so they can lower their internalized costs. Because if a tax is applied to greenhouse gases, or to carbon, then that becomes an internalized cost. Whereas before it was an externalized cost, the company didn't have to worry about it. It was out there somewhere. Didn't really cost them anything. Now there's a cost, so that gets internalized. So now they have a new cost item in their production process. And it's in their best interest to control that cost item, like every other cost item, in the most effective way that they can to improve the efficiency and the profitability of their operations. So again, that's a case of there is no performance standard. You can emit as much as you want as long as you're willing to pay. But obviously there's an incentive for the company to lower those costs, because there's only so much cost you can pass on to the consumer and remain competitive in your industry. Okay, so that's how a market-based mechanism works. It primarily uses the price mechanism that we all know when we go shopping for a t-shirt or a shoe or whatever. We always compare costs. It's the same thing. It's to bring the price mechanism in to an environmental control structure or environmental control regime that tries to lessen the environmental loading into the environment. And that's where market-based instruments come into play. Taxes are much easier than cap and trade. because cap and trade, you have to do a lot more monitoring, a lot more oversight than you do in taxes. In taxes, you set the taxes, you do a global measure of how well you're doing on reducing GHG emissions on a national basis when you report out to the Climate Change Convention, for example. Whereas in cap and trade, it becomes more intensive. You need to monitor whether a company is in fact exceeding its cap, and if so, has it acquired the additional permits by buying them from another company? You understand? So the further you go away from those mechanics, the more you go away to a more efficient application by the regulator, and in many cases might be even more efficient for the regulated. Just like in traditional regulation, the implications for the regulated and the regulator differ depending upon the market-based instruments that are chosen to address an environmental problem. Another major instrument is simply information and exhortation. Remember, we've talked in earlier lectures that, if you have to go to enforcement, you've probably already lost, and that compliance promotion is always the more effective mechanism because it's more efficient, it's less costly, the chances of success are higher. You go into an enforcement, anything can happen in a court, okay? Now, information and exhortation doesn't necessarily need a regulation to be relevant. We do a lot of things through information and exhortation that there isn't an applicable regulation that you could be punished if you didn't do it. I mean, we do that at household stuff all the time. The Blue Box program. If I throw or the green bin program, if I throw my plastics into my regular garbage, what is the government going to go around and basically prosecute every single household owner that doesn't follow the Blue Box program? Of course, it can't be done. Okay, so that's an example of how we do a lot of environmental things through basic information, awareness raising with the public, and exhortation, exhorting the public to do something better, to use less pesticides on their lawns, to use waste separation in the Blue Box program and the Green Bin program, to do all of these kind of things through information and exhortation. And people often don't talk about that, but actually we do a huge amount of our environmental protection activity in countries like Canada is done simply through information and exhortation. Okay, raising the awareness of the public, educating them on why this should be done the way it should be done, and getting quite high levels of performance through information and exhortation. And these are especially good practices when you have instead of 150 industries companies to regulate, you've got 10 million households to regulate. Quite a different ball of wax in terms of what the regulator can actually accomplish. Okay, so the regulator often falls back on risk communication, raising awareness about what happens to the environment when you don't do this properly. What happens to pollinators when you're using too much pesticide on your lawn? All of these things that are basically done through information and exhortation, as opposed to any enforceable legal instrument, and that relies on public consciousness to do things in the right way. But in order to have that consciousness arise, you have to educate the public through information and exhortation. Another way that governments, improve action in the area of the environment, which is a policy instrument, is socializing the costs of externalities, which is, investing in public investment in social environmental services that could not be paid for economically by any one user of that service. For example, water purification facilities. Okay. Communal hazardous waste facilities, where no one industry has enough hazardous waste no one company has enough hazardous waste to justify building its whole own facility for that, but 1,000 companies paying a small fee to compensate the government for making a major investment in a hazardous waste facility can contribute to offsetting the cost of that. But the government never fully offsets its cost, but it does it anyway because it's a public good. Okay, and we see, that's a very common environmental policy instruments. Again, I've said water purification, hazardous waste facilities, green space, these kinds of things that are not, that no one of us could afford to pay for the whole park and bird sanctuary ourselves, but we all pay communally through our taxes to have that in place. And that's called socializing environmental infrastructure, or socializing the costs of externalities. Okay? And that's, governments enter into that kind of activity. Why? To enhance public welfare. Because that's their job, right? I mean, they make these investments because they've calculated that without the public making that investment, no one individual would have the economic rationale, or even if or economic viability to create that infrastructure on their own. And so collective action through public instruments is needed, and that's the public investment in infrastructure. And of course, then there's policy instruments that governments produce that are blends of all of these things: regulation and market-based instruments. For example, some market-based instruments that exercise pricing on greenhouse gases, or pricing of carbon, might also have regulation that stipulates that, you can't exceed this value no matter what. Okay, so even if you are willing to absorb the price, you can't go above this performance regulation standard. Okay, there are many other cases where regulations are brought into play to support a public investment in a public infrastructure. For example, there's no use the government investing in a hazardous waste disposal facility if the regulations are not in place to make people use it. Okay, so otherwise you could build this expensive infrastructure and nobody takes their waste to it because there's no regulation or law that stipulates that they have to. So, often environmental policy requires a blend of these policy instruments. Okay, and often a regulation somehow is involved. Okay. In cap and trade systems, the regulation might be that you have to participate in the cap and trade system. Okay, and that's the regulation. And so even though you have flexibility to buy more for your enhanced emissions compared to a competitor, more credits, that is, you could buy to justify it or to make it legal, the fact of the matter is that you wouldn't have done any of it if you hadn't have been forced by regulation to participate in the cap and trade system. And there are many examples of where policy instruments often, and I would say probably in the majority, have to have some kind of a blend like this between the various policy instrument options. Even in the case of voluntary approaches, which is another policy instrument, but it falls under the category of information and exhortation. But voluntary instruments, voluntary approaches are often encouraged by the industry, right? They would like to do it voluntarily. And there's certainly mixed experiences on voluntary approaches globally. And I would have to say, on balance, the way it is that they don't work as advertised in a lot of cases. But it's in the industry's interest to advance these voluntary approaches because they don't want government meddling in their business, okay? But at the end of the day, voluntary approaches can be effective, but usually they're only effective when there's a real risk that if the industry doesn't voluntarily improve its environmental performance, a regulation is going to follow. Okay. I mean, in the instances where we find voluntary approaches do work effectively, it's almost always because there's a government behind it saying that, look, adopt this environmental standard as an industry group and comply with it, or we're going to be forced to regulate. Okay, and that's where don't get caught up in the myth that voluntary approaches just come out of the air and people are just doing it for the good of their health and so on. Or in some cases they do it because they see it in their personal interest, on brand, on competitiveness, on any number of other factors. But a lot of companies will simply not do it if they don't understand that by not doing it they expose themselves to more government intervention. Okay, so that is also a blend of policy instruments. So keep these dynamics in mind as you review case studies, look at how government is trying to approach industry. or improve environmental performance among any regulated community. Understand that, look for these dynamics. Look for, they've got a bit of a regulation there that supports the intent of the cap and trade system, or that supports the intent of the pricing mechanism on carbon, or that supports that it's idling in the background as a regulation, but they're going to give the industry a chance on a voluntary approach or a covenant of some kind, and so on and so forth. Because, of course, under each one of these categories, broad categories that I've given you, there are many, many different sort of permutations of these policy instruments. And so, for example, under voluntary approaches, a voluntary approach might be reached in negotiation with the government. So the government reaches what's called a covenant with the industry to improve its environmental performance. There is no legal backing for it. I mean, they couldn't go out and enforce it through law. But what the government will say is that this is our understanding on how you're going to do things voluntarily. If you break the covenant, we're coming with a regulation. Okay, and these are the dynamics that go into the politics of environmental instruments, policy instruments. Okay, so think about that when you're reading various case studies, or when you're looking at the press and what the Ontario Liberals want to do on climate change, or that the feds want to do on climate change, or that Alberta is doing on climate change, or whatever. And you can understand and start to piece apart their policy instrument strategy by looking at it. Well, what component of this resembles kind of regulation? What component of this resembles a market-based or price instrument? What component of this, is really about information and exhortation, and so on? And then you can begin to understand what's going on with the policy initiative. Okay, I'll leave you at that for this week, and we'll see you again next week.